Hang on there. Okay, I think are we recording now? Just check. Yes, we started recording. So super. So hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar this evening, which is being hosted by the Irish Society for Behaviour Analysis. My name is David Regan, and I'm going to facilitate the webinar this evening. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Risca Solomon. Risca is a behaviour analyst and the founder of Skybound Therapies, which is an interdisciplinary therapy company for children and adults with developmental disabilities in the UK. Now, we're really fortunate to have Risca with us this evening because she was an invited speaker at the UK SBA conference in London earlier this week talking about the same topic. And we really appreciate her giving us her time on a Thursday evening at 7:30 to give us the same information. So Risca has more than 2 decades of experience in the field, and she's got expertise in applying behaviour analysis clinically with individuals across the age range with a variety of support and learning needs, and also applying her behaviour analytic knowledge in OBM context, organisational behaviour management. And this evening she's going to talk to us about applying relational frame theory in therapeutic and in staff support contexts, which I think is a really interesting topic. Before we start though, I just want to cover a couple of things. There's going to be a CEU link at the end of the session that I'll share. There's a few MCQs, multiple choice questions within that link. So make sure you pay attention to what Risca's telling you, because in order to get your CEUs, you have to be able to answer those questions. We're recording the session, and that recording will be hosted on the ISBIL website in the coming days. I had a quick look today. There's already 16 past events that are up on the ISBIL website, covering lots of different topics, so that's well worth checking out if you're interested. There is a chat function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and if you want to ask any questions during the talk, I can pass those on to Risca, so she can just pay attention to her slides. And that's about it for me, so take it away, Risca.
All right, well, thank you everyone for attending. We did just have somebody bow out because they actually said they've already been to the talk, so they came on Tuesday, so I'm really hoping that you enjoyed the talk on Tuesday. So yes, we are going to go through today how we use relational frame theory across our whole practice, really. So a little bit about myself. I have a lot of flexible self-labels depending on the context. But Skybound began because of the young man in the swimming pool there. He came to us as a foster child at 4 years of age and is severely autistic, learning disabled, verbal dyspraxia, physical dyspraxia. He was born addicted to drugs, so has an awful lot of health issues as well. And then I'm mum to 2 little boys that are 5 and 10, growing up fast. And yeah, also a part-time farmer and use my behaviour science and all of that. I have graphs for my grass measuring and graphs for my beef cow weight gain and all sorts. So so love data, and I love everything to do with behaviour science. So we are an interdisciplinary company, but behaviour analysis does underpin everything we do. And yes, we mainly work with individuals, children and young people that have some sort of intellectual disability, are usually diagnosed autistic, and quite often have some fairly significant behaviours that challenge. And we've been going for a little while now, and as an interdisciplinary company particularly, we thought we were, doing fairly well helping our children and young people to develop socially significant skills. We were using the Early Start Denver model, the ABLES-R, the VB-MAP, the AFLs, the EFL, and we were seeing some good progress. But actually, we now know we did only have half of our house in order, really. There was an awful lot of other things that we needed to look at. And it was our clients that were driving our looking for other things, really, looking and what led us to RFT. When I first started out in behaviour analysis, I was a therapist. He had a low mass replication program from the age of 2. I started with him at 5. He had then moved on to a sort of more verbal behaviour program. But he wrote learned everything, lots of rigidities. He could read, write, speak in full sentences, but had no understanding of anything abstract. And 5 years later, and then 10 years later, we were still in the same position. We were stuck, he was stuck. He could never complete things like the ABLES-R, VB map. We would always just hit this sort of ceiling. Every single skill was being taught through direct contingencies. And we were hearing this story more and more. The more we practiced, the more behaviour analysts we took on, the more we were hearing things like rigid learners, concrete learners, needs to learn inferencing, reading comprehension. Let's put this program in for reading comprehension or that program in for inferencing. They could do some obvious relations, such as big and small. People saying, oh, they've got so much potential, but we just can't reach it. Things were words like they've plateaued. Concrete learners was something we kept hearing, and that they needed a lot of errorless learning or most to least prompting. During my master's, we were introduced to stimulus equivalents, and I realized that for this particular client group, this was the missing piece. And so then it led me down the path to finding this book, Learning RFT, which really opened up the world to the whole House of ACT. So if anybody's ever read anything by Russ Harris has got a document out there on the web called the House of ACT, and it is a really useful and interesting document because it really shows how behaviour analysis and relational frame theory have then led on to acceptance and commitment therapy and are the underpinnings to that acceptance and commitment therapy. But look at all the words. These are just some of the words that come with all of these different stages of the house, and it was a lot to take on. So what is relational frame theory? Generalized operant, explains how we learn things with no prior reinforcement contingencies, involves arbitrarily applicable relational responding or R-ing, as opposed to only non-arbitrarily applicable responding NAR-ing. R-ing is culturally established, responding evoked by the relations between stimuli rather than stimuli themselves. What a load of gobbledygook when you read most of that. You're just thinking, how do I get my head around this? And you pick up any sort of RFT book and all of this language just hits you. And then you go into the different relational frames and you're thinking all of these A's to B's to C's to D's. It's just not very well explained. You have to have lots and lots of multiple exemplar teaching to be able to even start to make sense of it. So back to our direct contingency learners, we were driven to improve our learners' outcomes. We knew stimulus equivalent and relational frame theory probably held the path to success for these young people because we wanted them to learn to learn. We wanted to improve their cognitive abilities. How could we help them move from rigid direct contingency learners to flexible generative learners? But all of that terminology that we just looked at, the processes, the principles, and we needed to learn all of that to work out how to teach relational framing abilities to children who didn't have them. And we literally really did need an awful lot of multiple exemplar teaching ourselves. We had to go to many different talks, conferences, read so many different books, and we had to have a team of us really debating it and discussing it and trying it with the young people. And we were really driven to learn all of this as quickly as we possibly could because we really felt that we were holding the children and young people back. And then another barrier was that when we started doing all of this, we also needed to bring all of the other stakeholders along with us, the parents, the educational psychologists, the teachers, the local authorities, the therapists. This just seemed like a massive mountain to climb. But it's all right, because according to Steve Hayes, RFT isn't that difficult. You learn it in one, you derive it in two, you put it in networks, and it changes what you do. That's it. That's all we needed to do. Except for, back to our clients, when you can't learn it in one, when you can't derive it in two, you can't put it in networks, so it doesn't change what you do. So actually, we're not able to access with our clients any of this derivation, these relational frames, this transfer of stimulus function. So we're going to start by walking through how we have learned to apply RFT with individuals with developmental disabilities to be able to teach them to be able to do these skills, and some of the little tips and tricks that we've picked up along the way. So we'll start with Learn It in One. You're all familiar with direct reinforcement contingency learning, but some of our clients can take hundreds and sometimes thousands of trials. They can't learn it in one. What we found is that Siri Ming has a huge amount of really great resources. They're actually free on her website. So this link at the bottom here will take you to her website. And she's published 2 great books, which are now freely available on her site to download. And it really focuses on bringing verbal behaviour and RFT together. And she's got some great flow charts that you can walk through and answer for your learner. But what we really wanted to make sure that we're doing really well at the beginning is things like commanding, easy to gain cooperation, generalized matching, generalized imitation, all the things that we've been doing for years. But when we look at it through the lens of this book that Doug Greer, and we're thinking about behavioral cusps, it's really important to think about those learning to learn skills and to measure its cusp effect. So I will be recommending a lot of different resources as we go through this book, because these are all the resources that we've used to come to this position that we're in now. And for those early learners, when you're just starting out, things like Siri Ming's book and the Verbal Behaviour Analysis book by Doug Greer are really important. Because actually these early skills that we take for granted as basics of ABA programs such as matching, they're actually teaching the beginnings of the frame of coordination. And we want to make sure then that we teach that to the best of our abilities in order to make sure our foundation of the frame of coordination is absolutely strong. So we want to teach matching across all senses: visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. And we also want to consider that imitation is actually teaching them the frame of coordination, sameness, to do the same. And so these early matching programs are actually non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. That is, we are matching them based on the formal properties of the stimuli being related: physical appearance, color, size. So it's not just a basic cognitive skill. Matching, or the frame of coordination, is the foundation for all advanced language and cognition. We're teaching the initial stages of relational responding. And what we see is that all relational frames are initially taught through non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding. When we teach relational responding based on the physical properties, we are teaching the cue, the contextual cue that signals that relation, and then we move into arbitrarily applicable or the culturally controlled relational frames. And here's an example of an early learner program that moves to that arbitrarily applicable relational responding. We would recognize it as receptive identification and as labeling. If we are teaching a learner to tact a picture or a real item of a cat as a cat, and teaching the receptive identification of the cat, that is us starting to teach arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And it's still in the frame of coordination, that the word cat is the same as the picture cat. We are responding based on relation of being the same. We then start to move to things like the first derived relational response, bidirectional naming. And isn't it great? We get even more terminology. So this is the first derived relational responding ability learned by children. It's a mutually entailed tact listener response. Bidirectional naming likely responsible for the explosion of language starting at 18 months of age with typical children. And we know from research that it can be taught to autistic children through multiple exemplar teaching. So we've got even more language here. We've now got bidirectional naming, we've got mutually entailed. So the aim of this webinar is really to break down some of this language. So stay with me for the ride, and I promise we will get there and get all of these lovely terms explained. Here's a nice picture from my Teresa Varriman. She's done some great work on bidirectional naming. And all we're looking at here is when somebody hears that is a cat, that they can then receptively identify the cat. And then that's the unidirectional naming. And then if they can also expressively label the cat, we've got the bidirectional naming, and that's without any additional teaching. So those are some of the basic programs. And so we need to be thinking about relational frames right from the very beginnings of early learners. And what I want to draw your attention to is that matching these frame of coordination programs, this teaching of the capacity for sameness across the senses, these are all different words that are used within some of the research, but all of this is actually starting to build coherence as a reinforcing consequence. We need to teach children to want to make sense of the world and the information given to them. And these early programs are laying the foundations for coherence becoming reinforcing. Making sense of things becomes reinforcing, therefore the behaviours used to make sense of things increase. And when we think about coherence as a reinforcer, I can't help but think about my journey into relational frame theory. I bought some books about relational frame theory. I bought the peak relational training programs, and they sat on the shelf for years. They sat on the shelf for a number of years because every time I opened them, it was aversive. I just felt aversive sensations because none of it made sense. It wasn't coherent. It wasn't making sense. And so we started going out to, we went to Reno to the Behaviour Analyst boot camp, and we bought Behaviour Analysts over here to do the peak 2-day training. And gradually, bit by bit, it made more sense. But coherence really is a powerful reinforcer. And often we will escape and avoid things that are not coherent because it feels so aversive. So when we are thinking about how to teach our learners to learn it in one, here are a few of the little tips that we've used. If we want to build the frame of coordination or the capacity for sameness, the concept of sameness as the foundation for language, we maybe need to think about what contextual cues we are using. What are the SDs that we're using? If we're using match and do this, are we really building that capacity for same? Should we change and just use one more consistent to show how across all the different senses we are building that capacity for sameness? Another thing to think about, errorless learning, great for learn it in one, but is it building that idea of coherence? Because actually they're not engaging in the problem solving, the skills to work, the actual skills to work things out and then get reinforced by the fact they have worked things out. And memory acquisition strategies. If we're needing to teach a learner through hundreds or thousands of trials, do we actually need to teach some memory acquisition strategies? Do we actually need to teach overt strategies to help memory? And Tizard Centre have a great video on their YouTube channel, and there's some references to some papers there. So those are just some tips for basic contingency, direct contingency learning. Now we move into the exciting stuff, which is the deriver in do. So we find that the most comprehensive assessment of relational frames is the peak comprehensive assessment. And the equivalence part is where we get into, obviously, the stimulus equivalence. So here's an example. ROG is the same as BIM. So you need to remember that. You're probably lucky that you're all on online, because when I teach this in person, I have everybody do some call responding to do this. Now, read the story, but use a different word that is the same as the underlined word. So we have Jimmy gave his friend a BIM, which made his friend very happy. And that's the instructions. Read the story, but use a different word that is the same as the underlined word. That's the instructions we give. And this deriver into the stimulus equivalence is actually first seen in children at the age of 18 months old, not necessarily being able to read and do the change the words, but actually the basics of derived relational responding starts from 18 months. So as I said, I am a part-time farmer, and this has direct relation to this this talk, because I have chosen some farming equipment in the hope that not many behavioural analysts are also farmers, and so you won't know what this piece of equipment is. So I'm going to teach it to you. Dave, as you're on the screen, you're going to have to be my student, okay? Are you ready for this?
I'm going to try.
So just checking, you don't know what this is?
No.
Brilliant. So I'm going to teach you, this is a tilt table.
Okay.
So now, if I ask you, what is this?
It's a tilt table.
Brilliant. So we've got the vocal response tilt table. So we've now got the tact or the expressive label taught directly. Now I ask you to point to the tilt table, and you can hopefully do that and know which one's the tilt table out of the selection of farm equipment. Brilliant. So now we've got the bidirectional naming, or the mutual entailment, or the symmetry, or just the receptive and listener skill. So I like to throw all the words on there so as we can start getting some frame of equivalence between these different terminologies. So now if I teach you to match, and I teach you to match the tilt table to this beautiful animal down here, we now have got this relationship taught, and hopefully Dave will be able to do the opposite direction. And so now we can get the combinatorial entailment, or the transitivity and equivalence, or the receptive by feature, function, and class as we move forward. Show me an animal that you use a tilt table with. Hopefully, Dave, you would pick the right one.
Yeah, you've taught me that.
And then tell me a piece of equipment. What piece of equipment do you use with this animal?
The tilt table.
Perfect. Now, if I teach you that this animal is called a sheep, because so far we've only been matching it and we haven't actually put any words to it. So if I teach you now, you can now answer the questions without any visuals present. So what animal do you use a tilt table with?
Sheep.
And tell me a piece of equipment that you would use with a sheep.
Tilt table. I don't know what to do with this, but I know what I use it.
Well done, Dave. Perfect. So 3 skills actually directly taught and 10 skills actually learnt. And Dave, you can rest easy now for a second. So what we can see is that with mutual entailment, we end up with 4 skills taught. And then with the combinatorial entailment, we end up with 6 skills that are learned. So we've only taught, the 2, but we end up with the 6 skills learned. And when we start to add the numbers up and just think about cow, sheep, pig, horse, goat, and we just created little triangles for each of those, we could teach all 6 skills and end up with 6 skills for each of those being learned. So a total of 30 skills taught, 30 skills learned. But if we ensure first somebody's got the ability to derive relations, we'd only need to teach 10 skills, and we'd actually have 30 skills that were mastered. And when we then add more items and think about 20 triangles, that's 120 skills. But actually, you only need to teach 20 if somebody has the ability to derive relations and get 120 skills in total. And if we think about 100 common items, do you want to teach 200 skills or 600 skills? I know what I would like to be teaching. I only want to do the 200 and get 400 for free. Thank you very much. Because that makes fast, effective, efficient teaching. And as you can see, we can make these complicated looking diagrams. Here, we've only got 4 skills directly taught. And yet all of these different relations can be learned if you are able to do the generalized operant of deriving relations. 4 taught skills, 20 skills learned. So as I discussed, derived relating starts at about 18 months, and it's mainly learned through multiple exemplar teaching in everyday life with typical individuals. The adults provide reinforcing consequences for the child working things out. We get excited when we can see them working those new things out. And so then making sense of things becomes reinforcing. The behaviours of deriving increase due to it being reinforcing, receiving reinforcing consequences. And so a generalized operant of deriving relations and connecting the dots between stimuli is developed. But our clients need this systematically taught because those with intellectual disabilities don't always have this ability. And so if they don't have this ability, they will learn fewer skills. Whereas if they do, they will learn more skills in fewer trials, therefore learning more skills in the available teaching time. And there is some research now to show that higher deriving abilities equals higher IQ scores. And also there's been some studies that are starting to look at behaviours that challenge and the connection with deriving relation abilities. So when we come to thinking about how to actually teach deriving abilities, the Peak Relational Training System does offer a very systematic approach to teaching these skills. And the equivalence module initially focuses on teaching this just through that frame of coordination. And that's equivalence is only relevant for the frame of coordination for sameness. We then start moving more into mutual entailment and combinatorial entailment when we are thinking about the other frames. But we are talking about the generalized operant of deriving, and Peak Manual gives us a lot of multiple exemplar teaching within each program and across each program. But also Siri Ming has brilliant procedures as well. And the great thing to know is you can actually start teaching any program. Once you've got the idea of how to teach all the different stages of deriving, you can actually just design any program you like yourself to be able to expand on this repertoire. So here's another example. This is a symmetry program I really love because often when I see a young person get to this stage, I know that symmetry is really starting to be there now, and we're getting somewhere, and we're seeing the first stages of that ability to move towards full equivalence. So we present a sample written word and say, spell this. So we present just like that, as it says hat. The participant should correctly spell the written word. And when we're teaching this, we're often teaching 3 or 4 examples within a set. We then start teaching these 3 or 4 examples to match them to some random stimuli. So we say put with same, and we will teach them to match these words to random little icons. And AI is great for coming up with these random designs. So we've just taught hat. Now, Dave, you've got to remember this because I'm going to get you to answer this in a minute. So let's get you to make sure you can match these and then match this one.
Okay.
Now spell this.
HAT.
Perfect. So when you think that often we're teaching 3 or 4 exemplars at one time during this round of trials, you can see why the memory piece is really quite important. I typically find that 3 is probably where I'm at this time of night, but when we get to 4, that takes a lot of effort. And when we do this, we first teach the skills. So we're teaching these matching skills, and we're making sure we therefore provide reinforcement. But when we come to this test, wherever it says test, there is no direct reinforcement provided at that point. So we are literally testing to see if this symmetrical relation can be demonstrated by the learner. All right, Dave, another example. So when we train B to A, I'm going to train all of these examples. Tigers have stripes. What do tigers have?
Stripes.
Porcupines have spikes. What do porcupines have?
Spikes.
Snakes have scales. What do snakes have?
Scales.
Now I'm going to train C to A. Zebras have stripes. What do zebras have?
Stripes.
Hedgehogs have spikes. What do hedgehogs have?
Spikes.
Fish have scales. What do fish have?
Scales.
Now, what I should say as well is for each of these training stages, we would often do them in a block of, say, 10. So each of these would be practiced 2 or 3 times each. And then we move to the test. And the test is C to B. So we've taught this B to A, we've taught this C to A relation. Now I'm going to test, can Dave do the C to B relation? What has something in common with tigers?
Zebras. Both have stripes.
What has something in common with porcupines?
Hedgehogs have spikes.
Yep. And what has something in common with snakes?
Fish both have scales.
Great. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, right. What I got there.
Another example for you here. So metaphorical emotions. So we're going to train A to B, and I would teach Dave to be able to receptively identify which feels sad, which feels happy, which feels angry. Then I present an array of pictures and ask, which is the fire, rain, sunshine? Hopefully, Dave, you've got all of those under your belt and you're okay. Now I would train the B to D relation of putting the emotion with one of the pictures. So we've got the happy here going to the sunshine. We've got the angry going to the fire. So if I then were to ask, how does someone feel if they feel like fire, Dave?
Feel angry.
How does someone feel if they feel like rain?
Sad.
And how does someone feel if they feel like sunshine?
Happy.
So you see, we've trained A to B, B to D, C to D, and we've tested then the C to A relation there. And it's within these programs, it's not necessarily about what we're actually teaching. There are programs that talk about relating different gods, Greek and Roman goddesses and gods and things. It's really not about what we're actually teaching. It's about how we're teaching it to be able to establish the generalized operant of deriving. And sometimes when we move through this equivalence module, there can be some barriers and there can be certain programs that we just think, why isn't this learner getting this? And one thing we found is that putting that program into a learning channel, thinking within the learning channel sort of framework can really help then identify if there's any particular learning channel difficulties that we might need to go back and do a bit more work on. For example, if the 2 pieces of information that you're relating are auditory to auditory, sometimes that can be really tricky. And so we need to go back and focus on increasing length of utterance that the learner can recall. So lots of memory work of verbal information may be beneficial. We may need to go back and check some of those prerequisite skills. So once we have got the ability to derive, which Dave has, he passed. So, we can move on now and think about what about the next stages. We need to now start putting it into bigger networks, into other relational frames. We now need to teach the other frames. We've now made sure that Dave can do the frame of coordination. So now we move on to the comparison frame, the opposition frame, the distinction frame, hierarchical frame, and deptic frame. And guess what? Peak has a book for that too. So Peak actually really structures it very well to go from the non-arbitrarily applicable relational responding, or the NARing, so that's where the physical properties are being related, to then go through the cultural, arbitrary, and complex relations. And if you want to know more about the developmental sequence within typical children for developing relational frames, there is a great paper by Kirsten and Stuart there for you. So if we think back to the assessment, here's some of the examples for the different frames in the assessment. For comparison, what is bigger than a baby? How is a ball more fun than homework? Distinction, which is different from cake, shoe or cookie? Hierarchical, which one contains a recipe, ingredient, cookbook, or JAX? And what we really want to do is to assess all of their relational skills, identify their strengths, their deficits, and then help remediate them through teaching the relational repertoires to expand their will, to expand their quality of life. If they can understand more of the language being spoken to them and start to actually make these derivations, then actually they can understand far, far more about the world around them. So let's look at an example from the transformation section. All right, Dave, you're up. Present the teacher and the deer. We ask, which is faster?
The cheetah.
Wonderful. Now we present the deer and the turtle, which is faster?
The deer.
Now we test. So we've taught two relations, the A to C, we've taught the A to B and the B to C. Now we test the A to C and the C to A. Which is faster?
The cheetah.
Which is slower?
The turtle.
Fantastic. Now I roll a yellow ball fast and a blue ball slow. And now I ask you to match. Where are you matching the blue ball?
If the blue ball is slow, it's going to go with the turtle.
Yeah, and the yellow ball?
The cheetah.
Great. And so again, whenever there's a test trial, there's no direct reinforcement contingencies. Here's another example. Find the same. What are you matching it to?
To the rock.
To the word rock. Find opposite.
Rock and the feather, because the feather's light.
Perfect. Again, find opposite.
To the feather.
And now, match.
The rock. Picture photograph of the rock and the word rock.
Great. And on this one?
The white circle matches to the feather because it's different from the black circles.
Yeah, exactly. Look at that. You worked it all out. We tested that Y to Z. So you can really see how these start to build in complexity and start to have to relate and remember all the different pieces of information you're given. And one of the really interesting stages is when you start getting to the deictic relations. The I to you, the here to there, the now to then relations. And Louise McHugh has put together a wonderful book called the Contextual Behavioural Guide to the Self. And she really goes through step by step how to teach these deictic relations, which are the foundations to perspective taking. And there has been some research, again, Maitri Savaraman has done a paper recently, I think last year, in which she talks about establishing these deictic relations and then making sure we generalize them into real world situations. Because when you first read these, the I have a red block, you have a green block, what do you have, what do I have? And then the I-you reversal. I have a green brick, you have a red brick. If I were you and you were me, what would I have, what would you have? I-you double reversal. I'm here playing golf, you are there swimming. If here were there and there were here, and if I were you and you were me, what would I be doing, what would you be doing? They sound really complex, but actually we engage in this type of behavior all the time. So Dave, earlier I was telling him about how I've been on the farm all day with 18 school children doing a farm visit. And so Dave thought about how I would be feeling and then sarcastically said, oh, so you're really refreshed. So we're putting ourselves into the perspective. Dave thought about, well, how is Risca feeling having 18 kids and their teachers doing all of these activities on the farm? We've got a storm happening as well today. And then here I am at this time of night presenting this. So we are thinking about and putting ourselves in other people's shoes. So Dave was thinking, well, if I were you and I'd spent a day with 18 school children, I definitely wouldn't be feeling refreshed. So we are doing this a lot of the time. We are trying to think about and predict, well, if I were them, and this were the situation, and I were there at that time, what would I have done? And so we start teaching it very, very simply. For example, having these toys with a barrier between, and you show them both the toys, and then you put the barrier and you say, what do I see? What can you see? And then you start the reversal. If I were you and you were me, what do I see? What do you see? And PKBA have got a YouTube channel that shows you a lot of these programs. And then we start to move up to more advanced. So here we train A to B. If you were in the garage, what would you see? Tools. If you wanted to see tools, where would you go? Garage. And if you needed to fix your bike, where would you find needed items? So you can see we start to train and then test. So when it comes to teaching all the different relational frames, there are a number of programs out there and there are a number of books. And yes, I have read nearly all of these because this is how much reading it has taken to get my head around this and to be able to apply it clinically. The resources are getting easier. This was probably one of the early books, the Derived Relational Responding book. These two books have all the flow charts in, and as I say, you can get those for free down here. This book is okay once you get into it, and then we've also got this book which is fairly good too, and the Peak books as well. And the Peak Equivalence book has got a really good introductory chapter. And for anybody really wanting to get their heads around relational frame theory, I always recommend first doing the Foxy Learning tutorial. That was my first sort of where the pieces started to fit together, was with Foxy Learning. So we've hopefully now got Learn It in 1, Derive It in 2. We're starting to see them put it into some networks. But it still doesn't change what they do, because actually we've still got some rigidities. It's not necessarily getting into real life. So now we need to make it functional. We need to teach flexible responding as they learn new information in the moment. We need to teach them to be sensitive to their context given the available information and the derivations that they can do. So we need to begin teaching them to apply their relational framing abilities in real-world practical examples. And guess what? Peak has a book for that too. So I have no connection with Mark Dixon or Peak in any way, not a salesperson, but when you're starting out, you need lots of examples of how to do this. You need multiple exemplar teaching yourself, and Peak does that for you. So here's an example. Putting away groceries. So Dave, you can match milk to the kitchen. We teach you that one. Train A to B. Where does this belong? That all okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. And then we train what's contained within the kitchen.
Got the fridge.
Brilliant. Now we test what is contained within this.
Yeah, the bottle of milk.
And now we transfer it to you being able to put away your shopping and put the milk actually in real life away. So involved in this stage is the transformation of stimulus function. So let's be a new behavior technician or an ABA therapist for a moment. And you're being told about Alice, and you're told she's cute, adorable, she's got a great smile, she gets really excited, her laugh is simply amazing. It's wonderful. It's so brilliant working with Alice. But then you get told, but when her laugh does go too far, watch out, she bites. So back here, you were quite excited when you heard that she was cute, adorable, gets really excited and laughs amazing. You were thinking, this is going to be fun. I can't wait to meet her. But then adding in this little bit of information changes the function of working with Alice and actually starts making it feel a little bit more, you're a little bit more apprehensive, and changes your behavior as well, because now you start looking for your arm guards because you might need them. So her laugh actually now means different things. And this transverse stimulus function has been studied and evoked within children with ASD. And this is one of the great papers. They actually taught jelly beans. They taught the different flavors of jelly beans. So they taught the flavor here, the word coconut. And they did a multiple baseline across jelly bean flavors. I think this is such a great study, multiple baseline across jelly beans. Who'd have thought it? And so they did all of the training. So they trained all of these relations for 3 different jelly bean flavors. And what they also assessed on this bottom graph here is manding. They did manding probes to see if they got derived manding. And they did. And there's been a few studies to show that. So once we start getting these skills into function and we start getting them to change their behaviors based on the skills that and the knowledge that they've derived, not based on taught skills. So they change their behaviors based on the derivation. We now need to start to think about how do we move that into some self-management skills. And the first thing we actually need to make sure we're teaching is noticing and naming. So as we can build towards tacting covert behaviors. And that can be quite tricky, but one of the really great resources we found is the interoception curriculum, and we've been able to adapt that to move from teaching more overt sensations to teaching more covert sensation labeling. And there's also some good ways of teaching labeling pain using stimulus equivalence as well. And we then also have to start moving from immediate reinforcement contingencies to delayed. So we need to start moving to the variable ratios. And we need to work on more than that. We need to actually extend the time and enable our learners to wait for delayed reinforcers whilst having no detrimental effect on skills and behaviours. And this is crucial as we want them to move towards identifying their long-term ultimate reinforcers, their values. So if anybody's done any ACT, you know about sort of identifying your values and trying them out, and then thinking about how you behave in the moment that something happens, say today, and how you behave, and using values to guide how you behave. But if we actually haven't taught them how to even do a simple task such as this, 1 work task for 3 Haribos or 3 work tasks for a bag of Haribos, how do we expect them to be working towards those longer, more ultimate reinforcers, those longer term reinforcers such as values? So we can then start teaching more abstract ways, and also just the self and match system, just to highlight that, because that can be really, really great as well to teach this more delayed access to reinforcement and noticing and naming your own behaviors. Self and match starts to bring in the notice and naming, because at the end of each interval, you will ask them the question, did you do the target behavior? And then they need to tact yes or no. And then there are points given for if the student and the teacher agree. There are points given if the student and the teacher don't agree, because they've still been able to label their behaviors correctly. But if there's a disagreement, then there's no points given. And this is all building towards working on these values. But there's also language that we need to teach to work towards those longer term reinforcers as well. Once we've started working on delayed reinforcement contingencies, we have to start teaching that language to bridge the divide between the immediate reinforcing consequences and language that are more associated with the longer term values. So if we've got somebody that likes getting big reactions from people through demonstrating inappropriate behaviours, we might teach jokes and practical jokes and label jokes and the language around them, such as making people react. And then we might start connecting that with the word humour. And then eventually we can start connecting that to words like connection. Because now we can get to a stage where we can use language to bring those delayed reinforcers to life. Language acts as an augmental to motivate behaviours in the direction of long-term reinforcement contingencies. And this is where we need those deictic relations. It can bridge the gap between the immediate reinforcers and the longer-term ones. And values work involves that hierarchical frame. How we act now, how we act tomorrow, how we act next week. Is it working towards the life we want to lead? And here's one way that we start to put this into real life with our students. So This is where we start to develop tracking or start to get people to notice the actual consequences that their behaviours receive. And then we start connecting it to values. So if we walk through this, we've got our typical A, B, C, our antecedent behaviour consequence. But now we've added in covert behaviour here. So an antecedent happens, and we start to get them then to label, right, what did your advisor or your mind, what was the first thing you thought of? What were the automatic thoughts? What did you notice in your body? Once you start to notice a name, you can then access a choice point, and you can think about how you want to behave. And at this point, if somebody's already got some values, this is where the values identified, this is where we want them to think. Am I working towards my values or away from my values with the behaviours I choose? And so we can map out the behaviour, the consequence, and the values. And so with some individuals, we'll put values over here, but with many of the individuals we're working with, it's often a case of we'll put values over here and then get them to track right. You're often triggered when the teacher says it's time to do maths. What happens? What do you notice? What are your long-term values? Oh, you want to be a gamer. Well, how are you going to work out, how much money you need to make to live and to go on holiday and things? If you want to be a gamer, let's relate maths back to that. What's the hierarchy that is needed to achieve their ultimate reinforcers? And then work out which behaviors are helping them to achieve that goal. And here's some great work that a team over in Bristol and Gloucester actually did, where they took that diagram and actually mapped it out on the floor. And they now map it out on the floor with learners that are at risk of exclusion from school. And they really use this with great effect. Dr. Nick Hooper and Duncan Galliard have been doing some great work using this model. But work on the relational frames doesn't stop there. Here's some real examples from our caseload. Young adult, own house, own job. Homeless man asked, do you have a spare room? Client answered yes. He had been taught to always tell the truth. Homeless man went home with him. Homeless man brought friends and the house became used for taking drugs. The caregiver, the parents were still quite involved. He was able to live on his own. He had his own flat, a job. He needs to get his confidence back and learn safety skills. Client was saying, I'm a failure. I want to be independent. I just don't know what happened. The professionals were saying, let's work on building safety skills, communication skills, social skills, teaching more rules to him. Whereas from an RFT perspective, we thought, okay, which frames are difficult for him here? Distinction frame. What contexts are different from where he was taught to tell the truth and when to change response based on a difference, i.e. a homeless person is different from a teacher. Dictic frame. If I were a homeless person and I was asking if you had a spare room, why might I be asking? What's the intention? If I were him, why would you be asking? Female 19-year-old can hold a conversation, find social disapproval exciting. Social disapproval increases behavior that it follows. Caregiver says, she's so independent, so able. She can go lots of places on her own, just need to teach how to talk with others when she's out and about to stay safe and to avoid talking to strangers. Client says, I want to talk to people. I like people. They're my friends. You can't stop me talking to anyone I want. Professional says, let's work through social stories, social skills, lists of people to talk to and people to avoid, social rules, basically. We identified that she needed to work on deck-tip relations, if I were you and you were me. And she needs to work on identifying here and now versus there and then relations to support with identifying quick reinforcement now, but how that could lead to danger and problems there and then in the future. So we've got through the little ditty of learn it in one, derive it in two, put it in networks, change what you do. So now we've got relational abilities. Now they need ACT to manage those relational abilities because, as we know, our brains like to beat us up. So there's lots and lots of ACT resources out there, which is great. So I won't go through all of those. But then I want to take you through some examples of how we use RFT with parents. Let's just think about functional behaviour assessments for a second. We come in, we do the FAI, observations, data analysis, we make a hypothesis, we write the BSP. Very much a bit of an expert model. But if we think about RFT, we can really think about how to start changing that functional assessment interview. We can, through language, really get them to describe exactly what's happening in quite fine detail through using evocative questions. Take me back to the last time the child showed the behaviours that challenge. When was it? What had happened that day? What was the weather like? Where were you? Where were they? Slow everything down for me. I want to know as much as possible so I can understand the experience. What were you doing when they demonstrated the behaviour? How were you feeling? What were they doing? Were they saying anything? Were there any noises? When did you know there would be a behaviour? What was the first sign of the behaviour? How did you feel? What did you do? Take me through every step in as much detail as possible. And bringing multiple steps to life like that can help them start to work out the contingencies. We also, with parents, start to get them to think about a 3 wishes exercise, really bringing co-production to the front. And the 3 wishes comes from an ACT exercise. But some parents resist thinking about the future. They say things like it's too painful. They experientially avoid thinking about their child's future. But sometimes, such as at transition times, we really need them to be able to articulate what they actually want. So we can use deictic relations to get them to think about their loved one. What do you see for your loved one in 5 years' time? Where are they then? What are they doing there? We've also had one of our staff do a 6-session self-paced online ACT training protocol as part of her master's to increase the frequency of values-directed behaviours for parents with ASD. And there's some great books. This one's a nice one, the Behaviour Analyst Guide to Working with Parents. And then RFT with our team. RFT with our team started with this book, The Mindful and Effective Employee. And so we started then paying for courses for our staff for things like the happiness trap and the confidence gap, reading the books, paying for the courses, etc. We work with some individuals that are really quite challenging. And so resilience and being psychologically flexible is really, really important for working with these complex individuals and complex contexts that they're often in. And mastering the clinical conversation actually was quite the turning point when we think about applying RFT to our team. The main team themes where RFT has greatly helped is there's often lots of shoulds. This should be like this, life should be like that. The comparison frame is often present. She's more experienced than me, she's better than me. The opposition frame, people think, well, I can't feel hope and despair, when actually they're the 2 sides of the same coin. Teaching team members to actually label the frames that they might be thinking, that language is just language, it doesn't have to be true or false. Really highlighting to them how it is just culturally made up. Willingness and acceptance of perceived difficult parts of the job. Working with children and young people with behaviours that challenge. Often, if a behaviour has happened, we think instantly our mind jumps to, oh, this was a bad day, this was a difficult day. But actually, can we just avoid the evaluations and think, let's just look at what actually happened? If we followed the behaviour support plan, we were compassionate, we learned more and developed more understanding so as we can help the person more in future. So really reframing the incidence of behaviours that challenge. But the more we did, the more actually we saw our staff were loving it and really enjoying it, and we were seeing real benefits with our young people. So we wanted to do even more. But our staff are based all over the UK. So we couldn't just bring people together in groups for regular weekly sessions like is described in the Mindful and Effective Employee. So we put a message out on the ACBS listserv, and Nick Hooper responded and said, I'm not doing it, but hope somebody else can do it for you. And we said, well, nobody else has volunteered. You know, we're going to pay you for it. Will you do it? And he was based in Cardiff at Cardiff University. And he was on the ACBS board for the UK and Ireland chapter at the time. So we managed to rope him in. And so we did a wellbeing weekend where we taught everybody about RFT, how their brains work, how we derive relations that are not always helpful to us, and then how we can start to use RFT and ACT to help us. And that culminated in a willingness variety show where everybody had to get up and do something and use our newfound skills to help us do things. And then that ended up moving to a second wellbeing weekend that happened in November, where we developed our own behaviour support plans using RFT and ACT, and overcame our fears and held spiders and snakes and cockroaches and all sorts. We even had people signing up to do a parachute jump, and we have got a staff member that won that raffle and is doing the parachute jump and using her behaviour support plan. And now we have a whole psychological flexibility support program. So actually, as soon as a member of staff joins us, they have a wellbeing webinar, which is teaching the basics of relational frame theory and ACT. We then move through these different stages, and all line managers have to now get to level 5 of learning how to use RFT and ACT with others. And then our leadership team, we also use pro-social at level 6, psychological flexibility at the organisation level. ACT matrix and thinking about deictic relations and moving around the ACT matrix is something that is a real core staple of our practices in team meetings, supervisions, conflict resolutions, business planning, and more. We obviously use all the organisational behaviour management strategies and things like that, but also our values. We speak our values out loud when we're having to make difficult decisions, and really make sure that we can put the value and the actions we're taking into that hierarchical frame and see how they are linked together to make sure we're working towards those values. We've broken down the values as well, down and moved the opposite way in that hierarchical frame to go, okay, well, if this is the value, how should the leadership team behaviours look? What should we be doing for the finance department, for regulatory responsible team members? So not just within the behaviour analyst department. We really focus on increasing tracking, and also a key area actually has been thinking about the relational frames that are involved in HR. As soon as I say HR, as soon as you found out, oh, HR wants to speak to you, all of these aversive words start to come up. But actually, can we change some of the language we use there? Instead of absence review, we've changed it to attendance support meeting. Because actually what we really want to do is help people be the best version of themselves in work to be able to help our clients. And yet the language that's often used within a HR frame is very much focused on the negative. So we've started changing a lot of that language. We've changed all our job descriptions. So as actually all the jobs the tasks that you might do as part of your job are now linked and put under the sections of our values. We've created behaviourally anchored rating scales that are also linked to each of our values. So for each part of your job description, for example, work with client to identify and keep client goals and family goals at the forefront, we've broken down into the 5-point scale. And that comes under the value of helping you to improve your life. And there's been some key takeaways from our non-behaviour analytic team members. So a social care regulatory team member loves how Skybound incorporates RFT and thinks about how our individual learning histories impact our relational frames, which increases everyone's perspective taking, which therefore increases everyone's compassion and flexibility. Our speech and language therapist, it fills in the gaps in speech and language theory. It addresses the learning to learn problems we encounter. It also incorporates everything from early learners to advanced language development. RFT is actually easier to conceptualize than all of the different SLT theories. And she's actually just submitted a piece to the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, and they have come back and said they're interested in publishing a piece on RFT, so that's very exciting. So here are some of the books that we found key for thinking about applying RFT to our team members. And really the takeaway point is that learning RFT is a behavioural cusp for us all. It enables us all to understand the humans around us more, to help our clients and team members more. It leads to more contact with reinforcement, helps us really to deal with those aversive thoughts, feelings and sensations within ourselves and be more compassionate to ourselves. After all, it's not our fault. Our minds can use relational frames. But to get the best outcomes for our learners, we really need behaviour analysis and that direct contingency management, relational frame theory, ACT and speech and language therapy to all come together and work together to really maximise their learning. All right, and there's my email. If anybody wants copies of the slides or anything, please feel free to reach out and I will send them over to you.
That was brilliant, Risca. You've packed in, it seems like about 20 years of learning into one presentation there, in terms of all the different bits of the number of resources you talked about and you linked as actions. And I found it really helpful that you said that you started off by getting those things and putting them on a shelf and not reading them because they were too, it was aversive to think about how they weren't understandable, because that's definitely a place that I've been. I might ask you one or two questions and then open up to anybody else if anybody else wants to. I know I've gone over time a little bit, but the psychological flexibility support program for staff sounds amazing. It sounds absolutely brilliant. And like, obviously some of the feedback that's come back there is really positive. I don't know if you have much of a turnover in your staff teams at all, but has been any change in turnover, any decrease in turnover, or is it just a general level of increased satisfaction and less reported burnout?
Yeah, so we actually are collecting data on this, and Rian, my colleague, has actually presented a few posters at a few conferences now, showing differences in skills and differences, sort of self-rating scales and things like that. And I would say, yes, actually, we've seen a huge difference in turnover. I haven't got the data in front of me, but we have seen a significant difference in turnover. And mainly because people aren't afraid to have difficult conversations, because actually we have all modeled going through the psychological flexibility support program. So I really feel like people know we're just all human, and actually calling out our covert thoughts. We've got more comfortable with saying, well, you just said that, and I had the automatic thought of this. How crazy is that? How crazy are our minds? And so we've all got a lot better at actually labeling our covert thoughts and how crazy they can be sometimes, and also got better at sort of saying, hold on, you're saying that, but due to my relational frames, I'm hearing this. Is this what you really mean? Because you can't control the relational frames of the person that's hearing your information. And if their relational frames to the words you're saying are different, then the understanding is totally different. So actually, we've all got better at our communication skills by thinking about what words mean to different people.
It kind of sounds like creating psychological safety as a space where people are more able to be upfront about how they're feeling and what they're really thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very good place to be. And then another thing that just came to my mind in a few different themes across the different applications we're talking about was the overall importance of language. And it really, one of the kind of testimonials you had at the end there about increasing compassion is one of the first things that came to my mind about, for example, about Alice being lovely to support, and also Alice might bite at times, and how that impacts what Alice, the transformation of stimulus function of the name Alice or the word Alice or Alice's house or any of those things for the individual staff member going in there. And I suppose I would have always just tried to kind of build up empathy for the person through thinking about all the kind of the challenges they're coping with, all the different things that might affect them, the kind of, the internal, external, biological, social, biopsychosocial model, all that stuff. But actually talking about how language affects us as a thing, rather than just talking about the specifics of it. And the skill, the understanding of it is a very important foundation block as well, isn't it? Think about
it. It really is, because I don't think we realize how much of an impact that our language does have. And as soon as we start to realize how much language we learn from, without actually ever experiencing the direct contingencies. And that's it, you know, that behavior tech had never experienced those direct contingencies, and yet now all the behaviors have changed. And yes, sometimes those behaviors do need to change, in that you do need to be more wary or make sure you are wearing the right equipment and things like that. But that needs to be communicated in the right ways at the right time, and with all of that compassion and understanding and explanation and the proactive programs and everything else.
We just have a question here from Priyanka, so thank you for your question. I'm just saying thanks for your beautiful presentation. One question: how can RFT benefit children with autism spectrum disorder, children who are autistic, who have no verbal language and have not yet developed a repertoire of skills? So starting from a low baseline as well as skill development.
And that's really talking about, you know, all those programs that I just touched on at the beginning, and thinking about how we make sure we're actually teaching those behavioural cusps, and looking at the Siri Ming books and the Doug Greer books, because actually just ticking through ABLES and VB-MAP, yes, all the skills are there to start building those frames, but they're not necessarily being taught in the right ways. Whereas when you look at Doug Greer books, and they're talking about the development of the cusps of the capacity for sameness, that is the frame of coordination. So when we've got somebody that is low skilled, we need to be thinking about teaching right from the start, so as we can get faster learning. We have been starting to apply some of these programs with individuals that use Proloco to Go, that, you know, they are severely verbally dyspraxic as well as autistic, etc. And we are seeing some good success with those. We are changing how we run some of the programs. You can't just run all of the peak programs if you haven't got those verbal responses, etc. But most of them we can change and adapt to suit. But certainly if you've got somebody that's not got that skill repertoire yet, it's really important to think about those behavioural cusps. And for that, I would recommend looking at the Siri Ming resources and the Doug Greer verbal behaviour analysis book.
That's great. I'm just kind of thinking about the learning to learn skills like you were talking about earlier on, in terms of getting there at the start point. I'm going to end the recording and allow anybody else who wants to come on camera to do that. So before I end the recording, just to have it on the recording, thanks a million, Risca. That was brilliant. I'm really glad that you gave us your time this evening. Thanks a million.